One of the great mysteries of psychology is our tendency to unwillingly repeat actions that bring little to no benefits or can even be detrimental to our well-being. Things like revisiting painful memories or self-sabotaging, or for us in the digital age, things like doom scrolling. These behaviors are very difficult to make sense of, and classical psychological theories usually explain them negatively, as a character flaw or as a structural failure in the mind. But most famously, perhaps, Freud interprets the compulsion of repetition as a failure of repression. But in so doing, according to Deleuze, he takes things upside down, and his model of the mind needs to be reversed. This is why, in Difference and Repetition, Deleuze says, "We do not repeat because we repress because we repeat." The first part of the sentence refers to Freud's model of the unconscious. The second part points to a very different form of psychology, one which defines repetition positively, and which Deleuze developed all throughout his writings. In his view, repetition is not a symptom or simply an effect, but it's a fundamental metaphysical principle that sustains and sometimes disrupts psychological life. It's perhaps one of the most complicated ideas in all of Deleuze's thought, because it completely changes how we understand things like consciousness, the unconscious, and their relation. But it's also one of the most important ones, because it calls for a fundamental rethinking of the very structure of reality. For example, in the very first paragraph of his first book, Empiricism and Subjectivity, Deleuze, drawing on Hume, calls for the substitution of a psychology of the mind by a psychology of the mind's affections, in order to constitute the true science of humanity. This shows that the psychological question, generally speaking, is very important to Deleuze. So in this video, we're going to examine his radically new model. We will first examine the philosophical origins of psychology, in particular why the concept of the unconscious had to be created. Then we will see how it was further elaborated by Freud, why repetition became a central issue for him, and how, according to Deleuze, he almost got things right. This will allow us to visit Deleuze's actual model of psychology, in particular how he uses the concept of line in order to understand more accurately things like compulsive repetitions and also normal mental health. If you want to understand philosophy, one of the best tools you can develop is a sense of logic. Today's sponsor, Brilliant, helps you do exactly that. This logical skill that it helps you build through a powerful learning habit is not just useful for making good arguments. It helps you analyze complex situations, break down ideas seamlessly, and think more clearly when analyzing complicated texts, which is quite useful when you read Deleuze. If you want to improve your logical reasoning, Brilliant is a great place to start. Brilliant offers courses in foundational and advanced mathematics, in science, programming, data analysis, and logic, all of which are grounded in an interactive method that helps you visualize problems. You'll train to think critically by solving interactive puzzles that challenge you to spot patterns and uncover hidden structures. All skills developed through habit formation, and this is exactly what Brilliant allows you to do. Using it for just a few minutes a day, at any time that suits your schedule, you can learn and relax at the same time. If you want to sharpen your reasoning skills and build stronger analytical thinking, you can try Brilliant for free for a full 30 days at brilliant.org/DeleuzePhilosophy. And if you stick with it, you'll get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thank you very much to Brilliant for sponsoring today's video. The problem of psychology became central to philosophy in the 17th century with the Cartesian revolution. When Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am," he placed the act of thinking, that is, the subjective psychological position, at the foundation of objective reality. But this shift introduced another question. What else besides myself can I truly know? Descartes' own solution, substance dualism, did not satisfy his successors, and so a philosophical battleground appeared around the problem of epistemology, which is the science that determines what constitutes actual knowledge. It was Leibniz who first offered a systematic metaphysical solution to this question. For him, knowledge is fundamentally analytical. To know something means to discover what is contained within a concept. As we have seen in a past video, for him, all true propositions are analytic, which is to say that one term of the proposition is always contained in the other. For example, if I say a triangle has 3 angles, having 3 angles is contained in the concept of triangle, and so the proposition is necessarily true. But Leibniz extended this model to contingent propositions, that is, propositions that describe things that could have been otherwise, unlike the 3 angles of the triangle. For example, if I say Caesar crossed the Rubicon, this proposition is true to the extent that crossing the Rubicon is part of the concept of Caesar. The analysis required here, however, is not finite as in the case of the triangle, it is infinite, but it remains analytical nonetheless. So in Leibniz's view, all knowledge is ultimately conceptual. But a great shift occurred about a century later, when Kant began to argue that some truths must be synthetic. A synthesis means that something is added to a concept. It's not discovered within it. In Kant's view, to know means to step beyond the concept and affirm something that is not contained within it. So for example, the analysis of the concept of a hand, as precise as it may be, does not tell us whether we're talking about a right hand or a left hand. We need to step outside of the concept in the order of experience constituted by space and time in order to determine which one it is. These spatio-temporal determinations that depend on experience are not conceptually deducible according to Kant. They must be given in experience, in a synthesis that transcends the concept. In this sense, space and time are not categories of existence, but conditions for the constitution of true knowledge. They are not things we know about. They are the conditions under which knowledge is possible in the first place. Real knowledge for Kant is formed when we relate an apparition to the spatio-temporal conditions that make it possible. This is the basis of his transcendental philosophy. However, with this view, Kant operated a major shift in ontology. If knowledge is grounded in the subject that synthesizes the relation between apparitions and their conditions, then the foundation of being is not the infinite world of essences anymore, but rather the finite subject who operates this synthesis. The finite self, rather than the infinite, becomes the first principle. This remained a central aspect of modern philosophy, but for Kant a problem remained. In his system, the relation between appearances and their conditions still presupposes an external link, a pre-established harmony that guarantees the convergence of sense data with the forms of space and time. Kant himself didn't provide a satisfactory solution to this problem, at least according to the post-Kantians, who were very aware of this issue, and they sought a way to situate this harmony within the thinking subject itself, since it became with Kant the first principle. Hegel, for instance, argued that knowing something implies knowing what it is not. Husserl argued that it means reducing apparitions to a certain core of meaning. But according to Deleuze, it was Fichte who was the most successful in this endeavor. Fichte stated that beyond the principle of identity, A equals A, there is a more fundamental principle, namely I equals I, which grounds the synthetic act. The so-called autoposition of the subject became the ultimate ground of reality. It changed the nature of knowledge again. Now, knowledge was defined as the process by which the subject, as a condition, synthesizes an internal change that modifies and actualizes it. But this move forced the post-Kantians to introduce a new and decisive concept. If, as they said, all knowledge occurs as a genesis within the subject, then the subject must find the data of this knowledge within itself as well, but in a part of itself which is not conscious. Inspired by a long tradition which began with Leibniz, they created a concept meant to designate the infinite field of possible change within the individual, and this concept was called the unconscious. Rather than being an individual situated in the world, the conscious subject now was seen as a small island, which is surrounded by an unconscious sea. This unconscious sea belongs to the subject to the extent that it's within it, but it also constitutes all the things that we are not or maybe cannot be conscious of. So it's probably not by chance that the desert island is the image used by Deleuze in one of his very early texts. But now the question became, how does the unconscious relate to consciousness? Philosophers and psychologists in the 19th century became very interested in clinical descriptions of all sorts. Cases of hysteria involving paralysis, hallucinations, aphasia, etc., instances of catatonia and apparent psychic fragmentation, multiple personalities, and also more commonplace patterns of self-sabotage or compulsions and addictions. All of these were used to elucidate the relation between the conscious and the unconscious. Great thinkers like Jean Charcot, Pierre Janet, William James, Gustav Fechner, and even Bergson all proposed interpretations of these strange phenomena that seemed sometimes to put the individual at odds with itself. Their shared ambition was to discover through them why we think and feel and act the way we do. But it really was with Freud that this conceptual framework achieved its most systematic articulation, and perhaps also its most famous one, in the discipline that he called psychoanalysis. Now let us see what Freud made of the unconscious and how he struggled with repetition. Freud developed two models of the relation between the conscious and the unconscious. The first one was formulated roughly between 1895 and 1920. It's called Freud's first topological hypothesis. This model divides psychic life into three parts: the conscious, the preconscious, and the unconscious. It describes a dynamic view of the psyche, which he explained in terms of energy, specifically the process of excitation and discharge. According to Freud at the time, the fundamental motor of the mind is the pleasure principle. Everything we do and think and feel is due to an innate tendency to seek pleasure and avoid pain by releasing internal tensions and desires. Those that are socially unacceptable or conflictual are repressed into the unconscious, where they build up and sometimes create neurotic symptoms because they cannot be released, and those that are acceptable can become conscious and be expressed socially. Compulsive repetition, observed in clinical practice, was initially described by Freud as an abreaction, that is, as a negative expression of these tensions. The repression of a painful memory through slips of the tongue, for example, was a mechanism meant to lower internal subconscious tension, and in this sense it still served the pleasure principle, although negatively. But around the 1920s, Freud really came to grips with the clinical observation that certain patients repeat behaviors in ways that do not bring relief at all. In fact, it can even harm them. Extreme apathy, hallucinations, or downright self-destructive behaviors seem to indicate that the model of repression as the origin of repetition did not work because it doesn't obey the pleasure principle even negatively. This led Freud to a new conception of the relation between the conscious and the unconscious, and in Difference and Repetition, Deleuze describes this as follows: "We repeat because we repress." Freud was never satisfied with such a negative schema, in which repetition is explained by amnesia. It is true that from the beginning, repression was considered a positive power. However, he borrowed this positivity from the pleasure principle or from the reality principle. It was merely derived positivity, one of opposition. The turning point of Freudianism appeared in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, published in 1920. The death instinct is discovered not in connection with the destructive tendencies, not in connection with aggressivity, but as a result of a direct consideration of repetition phenomena. So Freud's second topological hypothesis emerged as a consequence of this problem of repetition, as Deleuze says. Freud introduced the idea of a compulsion to repeat as a primary force in psychic life, one which is more fundamental than the pleasure principle. He posited that repetition was not merely a malfunctioning of pleasure-seeking mechanisms, but the expression of a deeper drive, the death drive, which he called thanatos, which is a silent, conservative force that tends towards the restoration of an inorganic state. In contrast to eros, which is the life drive that seeks cohesion, growth, and reproduction, thanatos is meant to explain the psyche's tendency towards self-destruction, stasis, and the compulsive repetition of traumatic events, precisely because it seeks a state of absolute inorganic discharge. This radical reconceptualization required a transformation in Freud's model of the mind. The second topological hypothesis now distinguished between id, ego, and superego. Here, the unconscious is no longer simply a repository of repressed memories and energies that occurs on the back of the pleasure principle. It becomes rather a structure that obeys a fundamental principle, namely the Oedipus complex. The id contains the drives, both eros and thanatos, and operates entirely unconsciously. The ego develops from the id and mediates between instinctual demands and reality. And finally, the superego is formed through the internalization of parental authority via the Oedipus complex. It imposes moral and ideal constraints. In this second topological hypothesis, the Oedipus complex is generalized to the whole of mental life, not just early development. In this sense, repetition finds its new theoretical ground. It's understood as the return of the repressed contents structured through the Oedipus complex, which can then produce guilt, self-punishment, masochistic behaviors, etc., that is, forms of behaviors that clearly deny the pleasure principle. In Difference and Repetition, Deleuze explains the second topological hypothesis as follows. I do not repeat because I repress because I repeat. I forget because I repeat. I repress because I can live certain things or certain experiences only in the mode of repetition. I am determined to repress whatever would prevent me from living them thus, in particular the representation which mediates the lived by relating it to the form of a similar or identical object. Eros and Thanatos are distinguished in that Eros must be repeated, can be lived only through repetition, whereas Thanatos, as transcendental principle, is that which gives repetition to Eros, that which submits Eros to repetition. While Freud's structural turn allowed him to describe the interplay of conflicting forces within the psyche through the notion of repetition, it also introduced a new problem. Why does Eros repeat Thanatos at all? This question became central to psychoanalytical theory, and just 1 year after the publication of Difference and Repetition in 1969, a psychoanalytical congress was organized in order to solve this theoretical problem. But no fundamentally new solutions were found beyond the Oedipus complex and transference as a practical curative solution. For Deleuze, the necessary solution to the positive definition of difference came in the form of what he calls process psychology, which he developed mostly with Guattari and which we are now going to examine. In the first session of his seminar called Reflections on the Anti-Oedipus, Deleuze provides a detailed overview of his understanding of psychology. He distinguishes between three major interpretive frameworks: personological, structuralist, and process. The first personological approach understands psychosis as a breakdown or degradation of the unified person, a failure in the subject's relation to reality or to their own ego. This view remains anchored in the idea of personal coherence and takes the ego as a kind of organizing principle. But like the later Lacan, Deleuze is critical of this tradition because it remains bound to a normative, commonsensical image of the person that only explains psychosis as a deviation from this ideal norm. The second approach, which is structuralist in orientation, abandons the ego as a reference point but retains a kind of abstract determinism. Here, psychosis is no longer seen as a personal accident but as a structural event, a consequence of the subject's position within symbolic relations and linguistic structures. The later Lacan of the Écrit, in particular, exemplifies this model according to Deleuze. Psychosis now emerges not from personal collapse but from a failure in the symbolic register, and what Lacan calls the foreclosure of the name of the father. Although this approach avoids the moralism of the personological model, it still interprets psychic life as governed by a set of pre-existing symbolic laws and endows analysis the task of decoding these structures. A little bit like Kant's pre-established harmony, the structure at play here is an external order that must be postulated as a fact of reason and cannot itself be explained. Deleuze departs from both of these frameworks by proposing a third radically different view. Now the whole of mental life, including health and psychosis, are seen as processes. This perspective draws not on the static categories of ego or structure, but rather on a genesis which finds its rules within its own unfolding. Inspired by 19th century German psychiatry, and particularly Jaspers, Deleuze sees psychosis not as a lot of self or a breakdown of the symbolic position, but rather as an open-ended voyage, a transformation of subjectivity through time. This view is quite famous. It was further developed by the anti-psychiatry movement, especially figures like Lane and Cooper, who understood schizophrenia as a lived process, a passage, not a defect. But then this begs the question, what is the voyage, the passage? This is where Deleuze's concept of line appears and becomes quite crucial. First developed in the Anti-Oedipus, a line is meant to designate the passage of the nomadic subject through time. Each of us constitute our own lines, but Deleuze identifies a few types that we often go through. For example, lines of hard or soft segmentarity, lines of flight, or lines of escape, etc., etc. Each type has its own characteristics. Lines of hard segmentarity, for example, designate our routines, things like commuting to work, sleeping at night, or going on a weekend. Lines of flight, in contrast, are vectors of potential becoming. To analyze a subject in this sense, Deleuze says, means to ask the following questions. What lines are you tracing? What flows are you plugging into? What machines, desiring, social or political, are you a part of? From a technical perspective, we need to ask, how does a line relate to repetition? In the most basic mathematical sense, a line is made of an infinite number of points, which represent the infinite divisibility of time. I can always divide a certain quantity by 2. But of course, this is not how we concretely experience time. As a line transforms and curves under the pressures of concrete existence, certain points stand out and become points of inflection. that is, points where the line changes its orientation. These points, Deleuze calls them singularities, and they can be anything from an idea to an event to any sensation to something that changes us, either increasing or decreasing our power to act. Now, consciousness appears as an effect of these points, or more exactly of these curves. As Deleuze explains in his book on Leibniz, individual subjectivity appears as the geometrical origin of a curve. It is the metaphysical consequence of the curving of a line. So from this standpoint, subjectivity appears as an effect. But then, it is also the point of departure of higher cognitive processes, which is why over time subjectivity comes to see itself as an absolute origin. And it's true that our consciousness allows us to anticipate or even create certain new points, certain new singularities that can then inflect our lines of becoming. But the reason that repetition occurs time and again is precisely because consciousness sees itself as a point of origin. The representations that it creates occur not so much as a result of unconscious processes, but rather in spite of them. If I think about something precise, or if I go make myself a cup of coffee, or if I create any sort of singularity that occupies my consciousness, I do so at the expense of all the unconscious and ordinary points that form the rest of the line, that surround this particular point in time. So in this sense, the apparition of consciousness may be an effect of a metaphysical process of tracing lines, but it's also a point of departure, of starting over again and again, and of actively suppressing unremarkable points that occur between any two singularities, that is, between any two conscious moments. So in this sense, the unconscious regroups all the things we do without thinking about them, or the things we perceive without noticing them. And consciousness can be said to be the actual and the unconscious, the virtual. And so the relation between consciousness and the unconscious now depends on the relation between the actual and the virtual, which is precisely what Deleuze focused on for the rest of his career. Perhaps we can better understand what Deleuze means when he says that we repress because we repeat. Consciousness as a repetition is fundamentally a habit. Habits comprise things like recognition of objects in a special place or an environment. It implies ways of speaking, knowing people, etc., etc. But overall, it implies the repetition of identical processes which actualize consciousness and in fact make it repeat itself. Consciousness can even actualize itself at will to an extent by creating its own singularities, as we've mentioned before. But what matters here is that this new relation between the unconscious and the conscious, now defined as the relation between actual and virtual, provides repetition with a new fundamental metaphysical status. Repetition becomes what both sustains and can also on occasion threaten mental life, because repetitions don't always occur in the way that we would want them to. So in difference and repetition, Deleuze says, if repetition makes us ill, it also heals us. If it enchains and destroys us, it also frees us. All cure is a voyage to the bottom of repetition. Mental illness and pathologies can occur when the line is cut by singularities that are a bit too unpredictable, too chaotic, disagreeable perhaps, which leads to a consciousness that is disturbed and cannot recognize itself. The study of lines that Deleuze and Guattari advocate for, then, is first and foremost the very practical study of which singularities we habitually place on our lines, and the evaluation of their effects. The therapeutic question now becomes, how do we concretely overcome ourselves and transcend our own limitations, our empty repetitions? How do we reach the repetition that heals? Deleuze and Guattari developed this theme throughout schizoanalysis, which, as we have mentioned, is roughly the study of lines. But perhaps we can infer a few more practical elements to find the repetition that heals. And this is what we're going to conclude our text with today. From difference and repetition, we can infer that healing repetition does not arrive in grand gestures, but it begins rather very modestly, with the formation of new habits, however small. These micro-repetitions can seem insignificant at first, but allow for larger transformations to take root, to try, to err, to discover what maintains and consolidates our lines, and thus to create new becomings, new lines of flight. As Deleuze and Claire Parnay say, lose your face, become capable of loving without remembering, without phantasm and without interpretation, without taking stock. On lines of flight there can no longer be but one thing, life experimentation. This is the way we can learn to cease to repeat the traumas of the past and begin to inhabit a different kind of repetition, the kind that heals and saves. But this is not a return to. In fact, it's an advance towards something else. In the words of Kierkegaard, who wrote a lot about repetition and inspired Deleuze in certain crucial ways, we can say that the repetition that heals is the following. Repetition and recollection are the same movement, except in opposite directions. For what is recollected has been is repeated backward, whereas genuine repetition is recollected forward. A forward recollection designates the moment when repetition turns into a process of creation and becoming. It's the moment we can test and maybe repeat new singularities and evaluate them against our capacity to live, depending on whether they allow us to resist collapse and do some meaningful progress. This is the repetition of the future, the pulse of something new that can then be made an integral part of our concrete existence. I hope this video was useful to you to understand where Deleuze stands with regards to psychology. Of course, this is not a complete overview of the topic, by far. There would be a lot more to say about this problem, but hopefully it can provide you with a few tools for your own exploration of the subject. As always, my deepest gratitude goes to my wonderful patrons, whose support is foundational for the making of these videos. If you would like to support this channel, please follow the link in the description. For now, thank you all for watching, and see you soon.